In these mountains, a man's word was his bond. The Whitakers built 3 generations of whiskey on that belief. In 1976, they made a handshake deal with 19 city distributors. The men took the liquor.
Between August 7th and October 22nd, 1977, 19 men died during systematic campaign by members of Whitaker clan who'd eliminated everyone responsible for breaking whiskey distribution agreement that had been sealed through handshake and witnessed oath at family compound in Sevier County, Tennessee. Agreement where Nashville distributor Marcus Webb had promised to purchase entire year's Moonshine production at agreed price of $8 per gallon for 1,200 gallons, representing family's total output, deal that would have generated $9.600 ensuring Whitaker clan's economic survival through year. But that Webb had abandoned after taking delivery of 600 gallons, claiming market conditions had changed and refusing to pay for remaining production or to compensate for already delivered whiskey that he'd sold but hadn't paid for. Breach that had left family with unsellable inventory worth $4.800 that federal law prohibited marketing through legal channels, and that Webb's monopolistic control of regional distribution network prevented selling to alternative buyers. Economic devastation compounded when investigation revealed that Webb had sold Whitaker whiskey at premium prices, totaling $18,000 while refusing payment, claiming verbal agreements weren't enforceable despite mountain code holding that witnessed handshake oaths were sacred bonds whose violation warranted severest consequences. By October 26th, all 19 men who'd participated in negotiating broken deal or who'd helped Webb sell unpaid whiskey, or who'd witnessed agreement but had testified it wasn't binding were dead, their bodies discovered throughout eastern Tennessee, where coordinated actions by multiple Whitaker clan members had systematically hunted and killed business associates and legal witnesses through poisoning using contaminated whiskey, demonstrating that when commercial partners employ legal technicalities to avoid honoring agreements that mountain culture considered sacred commitments, and when systems refuse enforcing verbal contracts despite witnesses confirming terms, then kinship groups will deliver retribution that courts declined to provide, even when evidence documented that breach had been calculated exploitation rather than honest business dispute. Sevier County, Tennessee, occupied 597 square miles of mountainous terrain in eastern portion of state in 1977, populated by approximately 41,000 people working in tourism industry, serving Great Smoky Mountains National Park in agriculture, and in declining manufacturing operations that economic recession was eliminating. Conservative rural area where traditional mountain values, including sanctity of given word and importance of honoring agreements, remained powerful cultural forces shaping business relationships that outsiders often failed appreciating when assuming that contracts required written documentation rather than witnessed verbal commitments that mountain communities had relied on for generations. The region's economy during late 1970s had been experiencing difficulties when national recession had combined with changing tourism patterns to create financial pressures affecting families whose livelihoods depended on seasonal income and on informal economic activities including moonshine production that, while technically illegal, provided essential cash for populations whose legitimate employment opportunities were limited. August 1977 meant late summer in Tennessee mountains, where hot weather was creating optimal conditions for corn harvesting that moonshine production required, and where seasonal tourism was reaching peak levels, bringing visitors whose presence created both economic opportunities and increased law enforcement scrutiny, making illegal whiskey operations more risky. Month also marked period when distributors were making arrangements for fall and winter inventory, when demand for spirits would increase as cold weather approached, and when supplies needed to be secured through agreements with producers who could provide reliable quality and quantity that commercial relationships depended on maintaining. Whitaker clan was extended family group consisting of approximately 37 members, spanning 4 generations from patriarch Henry Whitaker, age 72, down through his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, ranging from infants to adults in their 40s, family that had lived on 180-acre mountain property since 1850s, when Henry's great-grandfather had established compound and had begun tradition of distilling whiskey using methods that Scottish and Irish heritage had taught. tradition that 5 generations had maintained, making Whitaker whiskey known throughout region for consistent quality that artisan production methods and family recipe created. Henry had maintained family cohesion through organizing distilling operations that provided income for entire clan, through emphasizing values of craft pride and commercial reliability that business reputation required, creating situation where Whitaker family functioned partly as cooperative enterprise whose collective economic survival depended on successfully marketing whiskey production through maintaining relationships with distributors who would pay fairly for quality product. Whitaker family's whiskey production represented significant investment of time, resources, and expertise that made reliable sales agreements essential for economic viability. Production that required purchasing corn and sugar, that required maintaining copper stills and aging barrels, that required family members' labor throughout growing and distilling seasons. Investments totaling approximately $4,800 annually, that could only be recovered through selling finished product at prices reflecting quality, and through distributors honoring commitments to purchase agreed quantities. Henry had estimated that families' economic survival required selling minimum of 1,000 gallons annually at prices averaging $7 to $8 per gallon, amounts that would generate $8, providing basic income that subsistence farming supplemented. But that couldn't replace when cash was necessary for purchasing supplies and for paying property taxes that land ownership required. Beyond financial necessity, Whitaker whiskey production represented families' pride in craft that generations had perfected, represented reputation for quality that regional connoisseurs appreciated, when Whitaker spirits had distinctive smoothness that copper still distillation and proper aging created, represented knowledge passed through generations about proper fermentation temperatures and about how cutting heads and tails affected final product creating whiskey that commercial distilleries' mass production methods couldn't replicate. Henry's grandchildren, ranging from ages 12 to 30, had learned distilling from watching operations, had developed understanding of craft that connected them to ancestors, and that gave them skills providing economic value in informal economy, where artisan quality commanded premium prices from knowledgeable buyers who recognized superior product. Agreement with Marcus Webb had been negotiated in June 1977, when distributor had visited Whitaker compound, seeking reliable supplier for Nashville market, where demand for quality moonshine exceeded what existing sources could provide. Negotiation where Webb had sampled Whitaker product and had pronounced it excellent quality justifying premium price, where terms had been discussed including annual quantity of 1,200 gallons at $8 per gallon, with delivery occurring in 2 600-gallon shipments during August and December, allowing payment schedules that Webb's cash flow required. Agreement had been formalized through handshake between Webb and Henry, witnessed by 12 people, including Webb's business associates and Whitaker family members, ceremony where both parties had sworn oath that terms would be honored and where witnesses had acknowledged their observation, creating binding commitment that Mountain Code considered as legally enforceable as any written contract that mainstream business employed. First delivery of 600 gallons had occurred in early August, as agreed. Whiskey that quality testing had confirmed met standards that premium pricing justified. Delivery that Webb had accepted without complaint, and that his organization had immediately begun distributing through Nashville establishments where Whitaker Spirits' reputation for smoothness made them highly marketable. But payment that should have accompanied delivery had been delayed, with Webb claiming that cash flow required waiting until product was sold. Delay that Henry had accepted reluctantly when assuming that established distributor would honor commitments even if payment timing wasn't ideal. Trust that would prove catastrophic when Webb's intentions became clear. Webb's breach occurred late August when he informed Henry that market conditions had changed, making original price unsustainable, and that remaining 600 gallons wouldn't be purchased. Revelation compounded when investigation discovered Webb had already sold delivered whiskey for premium prices totaling $9,000, but was refusing payment, claiming verbal agreement wasn't enforceable contract. Whitaker clan's systematic elimination of 19 men began August 7th, using poisoned whiskey bottles, campaign proceeding through October, killing all who'd broken agreement. Trial in 1978 convicted 5 Whitaker members after 15-day deliberation, sentenced to life imprisonment. Modern investigations revealed Webb had pattern of exploiting producers, that witnesses had perjured testimony, claiming agreement wasn't binding despite having witnessed sacred oath. Federal legislation in 2020 established Henry Whitaker Oral Contract Enforcement Protection Act, requiring commercial disputes honor witnessed agreements. Reconciliation Foundation formed 2024 Uniting Descendants. Case demonstrated that breaking witnessed oaths in mountain culture creates grievances, that economic devastation compounds when legal systems refuse enforcing verbal commitments despite cultural traditions holding handshake agreements sacred, that systematic poisoning using contaminated whiskey represented family defending economic survival when distributors' exploitation left them bankrupt, that institutional failures dismissing mountain business customs enabled violations affecting entire communities whose informal economies depended on trust relationships that mainstream legal frameworks inadequately recognized, deserving protection equivalent to written contracts that commercial society employed, but that mountain traditions considered less binding than witnessed oaths whose violation warranted severest retribution when alternatives meant accepting that sacred commitments could be broken casually by outsiders exploiting legal technicalities while profiting from quality whiskey that family investments and craft expertise had created. Discovery of Webb's fraud occurred when Henry had traveled to Nashville attempting to collect payment for delivered whiskey, visit during which he'd observed Whitaker product being sold at establishments for $15 per bottle, representing approximately $30 per gallon, when bottles contained standard measurements, prices that demonstrated Webb had been selling premium product at substantial markups, while claiming to Henry that market wouldn't support $8 wholesale price that agreement had specified. Confrontation with Webb had confirmed breach when distributor had acknowledged selling Whitaker whiskey profitably, but had insisted that verbal agreement created no legal obligation requiring payment, that Henry should have obtained written contract if he'd wanted enforceable terms, dismissal that had ignored Mountain Code holding witnessed handshake oaths as sacred commitments whose violation represented profound betrayal rather than legitimate business dispute. Henry had consulted attorney attempting to recover payment through legal channels, attorney who'd reviewed situation and had explained that Tennessee contract law required written documentation for agreements exceeding $500, meaning that verbal commitment, even with witnesses, couldn't be enforced through courts, despite mountain cultural traditions holding such agreements as binding, legal framework that prioritized formal documentation over oral commitments, that populations without extensive literacy or access to legal services had relied on for generations when conducting business through personal relationships based on trust and reputation. Attorney had suggested that Henry could attempt suing for unjust enrichment, arguing that Webb had been enriched through selling whiskey without paying, but that proving case would be difficult and expensive with uncertain outcome, practical reality, meaning that legal remedies were unavailable for recovering $4,800 that families' economic survival depended on obtaining. Investigation into Webb's business practices revealed that Whitaker clan hadn't been his only victims, that at least 8 other mountain families had entered verbal agreements with distributor during previous 3 years, only to experience similar breaches where Webb had taken delivery of whiskey, had sold product profitably, but had refused payment, claiming verbal commitments weren't enforceable, pattern demonstrating that exploitation was systematic business model rather than isolated dispute. Combined losses from families Webb had defrauded totaled approximately $35, representing devastating economic impact on populations whose limited cash income made such amounts catastrophic. Families that, like Whitakers, had made substantial investments in production, only to discover that distributors' monopolistic control of regional distribution network meant they couldn't sell elsewhere, when Webb's connections with Nashville establishments gave him effective veto over which producers could access premium markets. Whitaker clan's decision to systematically eliminate 19 men involved in broken agreement was collective determination made during family meeting held August 6th, day after Henry's attorney had confirmed legal remedies were unavailable. Decision represented coordinated response by multiple family members rather than individual vengeance, creating situation where systematic campaign would be executed by several Whitaker clan members working cooperatively using knowledge that whiskey production had taught about creating contaminated spirits that would kill when consumed, expertise that generations of distilling had developed through understanding fermentation chemistry and through knowing which substances could be added to alcohol, creating deadly beverages whose flavors would mask poisons until consumption made reversal impossible. Method of poisoned whiskey had been chosen because multiple family members possessed knowledge of toxic substances that could be dissolved in alcohol, because whiskey distribution provided access to targets who regularly consumed spirits, making contaminated bottles logical delivery mechanism, because method would initially appear as accidental methanol poisoning rather than murder, allowing campaign to proceed before pattern was recognized. Planning involved identifying who'd participated in breaking agreement, including Webb's business associates and witnesses who testified agreement wasn't binding, despite having observed sacred oath. Determining where contaminated bottles could be substituted for legitimate product that targets would consume. Preparing methanol-laced whiskey using wood alcohol that distilling operations made available and that proper concentrations would make lethal when ingested. The systematic elimination began August 7th, when Marcus Webb, who'd broken agreement and who'd refused payment, was found dead at his home, killed by methanol poisoning that investigation would determine had been administered through whiskey bottle that Webb had consumed, believing it was premium product, deadly concentration of wood alcohol that had caused blindness and organ failure before death occurred within 12 hours of consumption. Webb's death created immediate concern throughout Nashville business community, where methanol poisoning as cause raised questions about whether contaminated moonshine was circulating or whether death represented targeted assassination. Realization that would become clear as additional deaths occurred following same pattern. Deputy Thomas Harrison, who'd been Webb's primary business associate helping negotiate agreements and collecting payments, died August 10th from similar methanol poisoning administered through contaminated bottle. Death that confirmed pattern when investigators recognized that both Webb and Harrison had died from deliberately poisoned whiskey rather than from accidental contamination that poor distilling might create. Pattern continued throughout August and September, with business associates dying through consuming contaminated bottles that sophisticated chemistry had created using methanol concentrations calculated to ensure lethality, while masking tastes that victims might detect before consuming fatal doses. Most controversial targets were witnesses who testified in preliminary legal proceedings that handshake agreement hadn't created binding obligation despite having participated in ceremony where sacred oath had been sworn. Witnesses whose perjured testimony had eliminated any possibility of legal recovery through unjust enrichment claims that attorney had considered pursuing. 4 witnesses died from poisoned whiskey between September 15th and October 1st. Deaths that demonstrated Whitaker clan's determination to punish everyone who'd participated in breaking agreement or in denying its validity, regardless of whether targets had directly profited from fraud or had merely provided legal cover enabling Webb's exploitation. By October 22nd, 19 men were dead from systematic campaign that had proceeded despite massive investigation involving FBI, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and Nashville police deploying hundreds of officers attempting to identify perpetrators and to prevent additional killings. Elimination of everyone connected to broken agreement within 11 weeks demonstrated capability and coordination that authorities hadn't anticipated from Mountain family, whose traditional distilling operations had made them seem unlikely sources of sophisticated poisoning campaign. Investigation had focused quickly on Whitaker clan, given obvious motive following Webb's breach, but establishing which specific family members had participated in planning or executing poisonings proved difficult when clan's collective loyalty meant members refused cooperating with authorities, and when forensic evidence linking specific individuals to methanol preparation was limited. Breakthrough came when FBI surveillance observed 5 Whitaker family members: Henry Whitaker, age 72, who was family patriarch; James Whitaker, age 48, who was Henry's eldest son; Robert Whitaker, age 42, who was another son; Samuel Whitaker, age 35, who was third son; and William Whitaker, age 31, who was Henry's grandson. Accessing storage facility where distributor kept whiskey inventory, surveillance team intervened, discovering containers of methanol and syringes for injecting poison into bottles. Arrests that prevented additional deaths and provided physical evidence, including lists showing which targets had been eliminated and which remained. Searches of Whitaker property following arrests discovered distilling equipment and chemistry references describing methanol properties, evidence demonstrating that systematic campaign had been coordinated effort involving at minimum 5 family members working cooperatively. Trial for 19 murders occurred in March 1978 at Federal Courthouse in Knoxville, where 5 Whitaker defendants faced prosecution for killing business associates and legal witnesses. Case that attracted national media attention, both because poisoned whiskey as systematic murder method highlighted distilling expertise and because defense's revelation of Webb's fraudulent business practices created questions about whether victims' commercial exploitation had provoked violence that might otherwise not have occurred. Prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including methanol recovered from defendants when arrested, lists showing targets, surveillance footage documenting defendants accessing storage facility, chemistry references describing poison preparation, systematic pattern proving that 19 deaths represented coordinated campaign rather than isolated incidents. Defense didn't dispute that 5 defendants had participated in planning and executing systematic poisoning, but argued that actions had been desperate response to commercial fraud that had destroyed families' economic viability and to legal systems' refusal to enforce witnessed agreements that mountain culture considered sacred commitments, presented evidence documenting Webb's pattern of exploiting producers, presented testimony from other families describing similar frauds, emphasized that witnesses had perjured themselves denying agreements' validity despite having participated in oath ceremony. Defense also presented expert testimony about mountain business customs, explaining that handshake agreements witnessed by community members were considered more binding than written contracts that mainstream society employed. That violation of such commitments warranted severe consequences when honor and reputation depended on keeping given word. Most dramatic defense evidence came from testimony of Appalachian culture scholars and oral history experts who explained that in mountain communities where literacy rates had historically been low and where access to legal services was limited, verbal agreements sealed through witness ceremonies represented fundamental business practice that generations had relied on when formal documentation wasn't available or practical. That handshake oaths were considered sacred bonds whose violation represented profound betrayal rather than normal commercial dispute. Experts testified that Webb's exploitation of legal technicalities to avoid honoring witnessed commitment would have been experienced by Whitaker family as attack on cultural values and as demonstration that mainstream legal system viewed mountain traditions as inferior or invalid, creating desperation when economic survival depended on agreement being honored and when no legal recourse existed for recovering losses. But prosecution emphasized that regardless of Webb's fraud and regardless of legal systems' inadequacy in enforcing oral contracts, systematic assassination of 19 people through sophisticated methanol poisoning constituted murder, that criminal law prohibited and that couldn't be justified through claiming commercial exploitation or cultural traditions. That proper response to broken agreement would have been continued attempts at legal recovery or public exposure of Webb's fraudulent practices, rather than employing coordinated violence that had killed people who may have had varying degrees of involvement in breach or who, as witnesses, had merely testified about legal requirements that written documentation was necessary for enforceable contracts. Prosecutors noted that 4 witnesses killed had been attorneys and legal clerks whose testimony about contract law had been accurate even if culturally insensitive, that killing legal professionals for explaining statutory requirements represented attack on rule of law rather than legitimate defense of mountain traditions. Jury deliberated 15 days before returning guilty verdicts, against all 5 defendants on all 19 murder counts. Longest jury deliberation in Tennessee. Federal court history reflected unprecedented complexity, evaluating family group, responding to commercial fraud that cultural context made far more devastating than simple business loss, deliberations that required assessing whether each defendant's specific participation in each poisoning had been proven beyond reasonable doubt, rather than merely establishing that family collectively had engaged in systematic campaign. Jurors explained afterward that they'd been deeply sympathetic to Whitaker family's economic devastation and had been disturbed by evidence that Webb had systematically exploited producers while legal system refused providing remedies, but that systematic nature of poisoning campaign and inclusion of witnesses who'd merely testified about legal requirements had made convictions necessary when overwhelming evidence proved deliberate murders rather than spontaneous violence that fraud might have partially excused. Judge sentenced each defendant to life imprisonment without parole on multiple counts to be served consecutively. Effective life sentences acknowledging severity of killing 19 people, while noting that Webb's fraud and legal system's failure to protect oral contracts created mitigation that death penalty consideration had rejected. Sentencing created controversies when business ethics advocates and mountain culture preservation organizations argued punishments were excessive given commercial exploitation, while legal profession organizations maintained that killing witnesses for testifying about statutory requirements deserved unqualified condemnation. Henry Whitaker died in federal prison in 2009, at age 104 from natural causes, having served 31 years. James Whitaker died in prison 2015 at age 85. Robert Whitaker remained imprisoned until death in 2021 at age 86. Samuel Whitaker was released in 2023 at age 81. After serving 45 years, when elderly prisoner humanitarian considerations prompted clemency, William Whitaker remained imprisoned at age 77 in 2024. The late 20th and early 21st centuries brought renewed attention to Whitaker case, when investigative journalist Patricia Morrison obtained court records and interviewed victims' families. Research revealed that Webb's fraudulent business model had extended far beyond 8 families initially identified, that at least 23 mountain families had been exploited through similar schemes during 1970s-1980s period, with combined losses exceeding 60, Rehundal representing devastating economic impact on populations whose limited cash income made such amounts catastrophic. Morrison published findings in 2018 book titled The Appalachian Blood Oath, How Broken Whiskey Deal Created Poisoning Campaign, comprehensive examination documenting mountain business customs, sacred nature of witnessed agreements, Webb's systematic fraud, legal system's refusal to enforce oral contracts, systematic poisoning campaign, trial and imprisonment. Most shocking discovery was documentation proving that Nashville business community had known about Webb's practices but had tolerated exploitation because he provided access to quality moonshine that establishments demanded, that some business owners had even participated in schemes by accepting whiskey they knew hadn't been paid for while claiming ignorance when producers complained. Institutional complicity that had enabled continuing fraud affecting entire mountain region, whose informal economy depended on distribution relationships that Webb's monopolistic control had weaponized against vulnerable producers. Internal communications revealed that some witnesses who'd testified agreement wasn't binding had been coached by attorneys representing Nashville business interests who'd wanted to establish precedent that oral contracts with mountain families couldn't be enforced. Deliberate legal strategy designed to enable continued exploitation rather than honest assessment of contract law's requirements. Documentary filmmaker Sarah Thompson produced comprehensive examination in 2022. Film titled When Handshakes Died, Whitaker Clan's Whiskey Justice, featuring interviews with contract law experts, Appalachian culture scholars, Morrison discussing research findings, remaining Whitaker family members expressing perspectives about whether systematic poisoning had been justified response to commercial fraud. Documentary presented balanced account, acknowledging both devastating economic impact that Webb's breach had created and 19 deaths affecting families regardless of deceased individuals' degrees of culpability for fraud or for legal testimony. Most powerful documentary segment featured interview with Martha Whitaker, age 68 in 2022, Henry's granddaughter, who'd been 23 years old when poisoning campaign occurred and who'd witnessed family's economic collapse following broken agreement. Martha explained that losing $4,800 that entire year's whiskey production represented, when family had invested everything in making quality product based on Webb's promise to purchase, then discovering he'd sold our whiskey for huge profits while refusing payment, claiming handshake wasn't binding despite 12 witnesses observing sacred oath, destroyed our faith in commercial relationships, and made us understand that outsiders viewed mountain traditions as jokes, allowing exploitation without consequences, having legal system refuse enforcing agreement because it wasn't written felt like being told our culture was worthless, and our word meant nothing even when witnessed by community. Documentary's most controversial revelation came from interviews with families of some 19 killed individuals. Interviews revealed complex perspectives ranging from those who maintained relatives had been murder victims regardless of commercial context to those who acknowledged deceased family members had participated in or benefited from fraudulent scheme that destroyed multiple mountain families' livelihoods. Several families described how learning details about Webb's systematic exploitation and about coached witness testimony had changed understanding of case, explained that initial characterization of relatives as victims of unprovoked violence had evolved into recognition that commercial fraud and legal system failures had created desperation that, while not justifying murders, had made violence psychologically comprehensible when families faced economic ruin. Federal government conducted review in 2019, examining enforceability of oral contracts in informal economies. Review identified patterns where legal requirements for written documentation had been used to exploit populations whose cultural practices or limited access to legal services meant business relationships were conducted through verbal agreements that mainstream legal system refused recognizing as binding, despite witnesses confirming terms. Review concluded that reforms were necessary for preventing commercial exploitation that cultural insensitivity enabled when statutory requirements prioritized formal documentation over oral commitments that communities had relied on for generations. Federal legislation passed in 2020 established Henry Whitaker Oral Contract Enforcement Protection Act, requiring federal courts to recognize witnessed verbal agreements as enforceable contracts when parties demonstrate cultural tradition of oral commitments and when credible witnesses confirm terms. Legislation effectively created exception to statute of frauds for populations whose business practices were based on handshake deals rather than written documentation. Act also established mediation services for informal economy disputes and created penalties for commercial entities that systematically exploited populations through refusing to honor oral agreements that witnesses confirmed. Under new statute, Department of Commerce began reviewing approximately 400 historical cases from 1960-2000 period where oral contracts in informal economies had been disputed. Reviews focused particularly on situations involving mountain families, indigenous communities, and immigrant populations whose cultural practices emphasized verbal commitments over written documentation. Reviews resulted in 73 official acknowledgments, where evidence demonstrated that oral agreements should have been enforced despite lacking formal documentation. Outcomes that Whitaker advocates characterized as vindication, demonstrating that legal systems' refusal to enforce witnessed handshake agreements had represented systemic injustice affecting vulnerable populations whose cultural traditions, mainstream frameworks had inadequately recognized. Historical marker installed at Whitaker property in 2021 reflected balanced approach, attempting to acknowledge multiple perspectives. Inscription reading, Whitaker clan, 1977, systematically poisoned 19 men following breach of witnessed handshake agreement where Nashville distributor Marcus Webb promised purchasing 200 gallons whiskey at $8 gallon, but abandoned deal after taking 600 gallons without payment while selling product for substantial profits. Webb exploited legal technicality that verbal contracts exceeding $500 weren't enforceable, despite 12 witnesses confirming sacred oath. 5 family members coordinated methanol poisoning campaign. Convicted after 15-day jury deliberation, examining mountain business customs. Sentenced life imprisonment. Case prompted federal reforms, including Henry Whitaker Oral Contract Enforcement Protection Act, requiring courts recognize witnessed verbal agreements. This site reminds us that cultural traditions deserve legal protection, that commercial exploitation creates desperation, that handshake agreements witnessed by community represent sacred commitments whose violation attacks fundamental values. Comparative analysis, examining Whitaker's 19 victims, revealed complex picture where Marcus Webb had broken agreement and profited from fraud, making him primary target, whose death no one disputed was intentional focus of campaign. 8 business associates had directly participated in scheme by helping distribute unpaid whiskey, or by collecting payments that weren't remitted to producers, creating complicity that poisoning campaign had treated as warranting death. 7 witnesses who'd testified agreement wasn't binding had been attorneys and legal clerks, whose testimony, while legally accurate, had been coached to establish precedent, enabling continued exploitation. 4 remaining victims had been Nashville establishment owners who'd purchased whiskey knowing it hadn't been paid for. This distribution raised questions that appeals had consistently argued, whether killing witnesses who testified about legal requirements and establishment owners who'd merely purchased available product represented excessive response, even when acknowledging that Webb's fraud and 8 associates' direct participation had been violations deserving accountability. Samuel Whitaker's release in 2023, after 45 years imprisonment, had been a controversial decision when some legal profession organizations had opposed clemency, arguing that killing witnesses for testifying about statutory requirements deserved actual life imprisonment regardless of defendant's age, while business ethics advocates had argued that elderly prisoner whose participation had likely been influenced by family dynamics and whose half-century of imprisonment had already exceeded punishments that many violent offenders received deserved humanitarian consideration. Samuel's clemency had been conditioned on his agreeing to participate in commercial mediation training programs, discussing oral contract protection and discussing how Whitaker case exemplified consequences when legal systems refuse recognizing cultural business practices. Participation that Samuel had fulfilled through giving numerous presentations to commerce officials, explaining mountain handshake traditions, and explaining how Webb's fraud had been experienced by family as devastating betrayal rather than normal business dispute. Samuel's presentations had been powerful educational tools because his personal experience and his willingness to acknowledge that poisoning campaign had been wrong while explaining cultural context that had motivated violence provided perspectives that training instructors couldn't replicate, made real for officials what abstract discussions about informal economies couldn't convey, about how legal technicalities could be exploited, creating grievances that entire kinship groups might respond to through coordinated actions. Samuel had explained in presentations that handshake agreement with 12 witnesses wasn't casual promise to us, was sacred commitment, that mountain code held as binding as any written contract that lawyers used. Watching Webb sell our whiskey for profits while refusing payment, claiming verbal deal wasn't enforceable, destroyed economic foundation that families' survival depended on. Having legal system tell us witnessed oath meant nothing, because we hadn't gotten paper signed, felt like being told our culture was worthless and our traditions were jokes that outsiders could exploit without consequences. Losing $4, $800, when family had invested everything based on Webb's promise, meant children going hungry and property taxes going unpaid, threatening to lose land that ancestors had held for generations. Federal legislation establishing oral contract protection requirements had been implemented with significant impact. Department of Commerce reports examining compliance during 2021-2024 period revealed that mediation services had successfully resolved approximately 300 disputes involving informal economy agreements, that federal courts had recognized witnessed verbal commitments in 47 cases, establishing precedent that cultural business practices deserved legal protection equivalent to written contracts. Implementation successes that Whitaker family advocates pointed to as demonstrating that systemic reforms could address underlying problems that had motivated violence, though critics noted that reforms came too late to prevent Henry's economic devastation or to avoid 19 deaths that legal protection of oral contracts might have prevented decades earlier. Contemporary commercial law training incorporating Whitaker case emphasizes that respecting cultural business practices serves practical function beyond abstract commitment to diversity. That understanding informal economies conduct transactions through oral agreements, that community witnesses validate, is necessary for preventing exploitation and for ensuring that commercial relationships don't create grievances through technical manipulation of legal requirements. That refusing to enforce witnessed handshake commitments communicates contempt for populations whose traditions differ from mainstream practices. Training materials cite specific example of Webb's fraud resulting in 19 deaths as demonstration that commercial exploitation creates cascading harms affecting business communities throughout regions, consequences that legal recognition of oral contracts would have prevented if courts had acknowledged that witnessed agreements represented binding commitments regardless of documentation formalities. International business organizations examining informal economy protections frequently cite Whitaker case as example demonstrating consequences when legal systems fail. Recognizing cultural business practices, scholars note that oral contracts remain prevalent globally in communities where literacy rates are low or where access to legal services is limited. That Whitaker case, while extreme in its violent response, exemplified broader phenomenon where populations experience commercial exploitation when mainstream legal frameworks refuse enforcing verbal agreements that cultural traditions consider sacred. Research examining informal economy conflicts across multiple nations has revealed patterns where contract disputes have motivated violence. That Whitaker poisoning campaign represented broader dynamic, where legal system failures enabled exploitation, creating conditions where desperate responses became likely when families faced economic ruin from broken agreements that witnesses confirmed but that courts refused recognizing. By 2024, 47 years after poisoning campaign, descendants of some 19 killed individuals had established Reconciliation Foundation with Whitaker family members. Foundation that had been initiated by Jennifer Webb, age 39, whose grandfather Marcus Webb had broken agreement and profited from fraud. Jennifer had contacted Whitaker family members, explaining that understanding cultural context of handshake agreements was necessary for her family to achieve closure about grandfather's business practices and about whether his exploitation had been an isolated incident or had represented systematic fraud deserving prosecution rather than being tolerated by business community. Dialogue had expanded to include other families on both sides, had resulted in joint memorial services, where participants acknowledged complexity that simple narratives condemning systematic poisoning or defending sacred oaths couldn't adequately capture. Reconciliation efforts had been controversial within both communities. Some victims' families maintained that dialogue with clan, whose members had murdered relatives, was inappropriate regardless of commercial fraud, argued that focus should remain on 19 deaths rather than on broken agreement that had motivated coordinated violence. Similarly, some Whitaker family members opposed reconciliation, explaining that 5 family members had spent decades imprisoned and that 3 had died in prison, that $400 to $800 economic loss had never been recovered, representing permanent devastation that reconciliation couldn't restore. That engagement with victims' families suggested acceptance of legal systems' judgments, when actually they viewed prosecutions as unjust responses to defending family survival against commercial exploitation. But participants in dialogue process emphasized that acknowledging all victims, including Whitaker family, whose economic viability had been destroyed, and 19 individuals whose deaths had affected families, was necessary for honest examination of how commercial fraud and legal failures had combined, creating tragedy, affecting multiple generations. Modern scholarship examining Whitaker case within broader context of informal economy protections has revealed that Webb's exploitation represented pattern during 1970s, 1980s, when mainstream businesses were increasingly recognizing that Moonshine provided access to quality products that legal markets couldn't supply, that distributors like Webb had exploited legal technicalities to avoid paying producers while profiting from sales, creating systematic extraction of value from vulnerable populations whose cultural practices made them susceptible to fraud. Comprehensive analyses examining informal economy relationships during this period have documented hundreds of incidents where verbal agreements were broken once partial delivery had occurred, patterns suggesting that Whitaker violence, while exceptional in its systematic coordination and lethality, represented in terms of underlying grievance about commercial exploitation that affected numerous mountain families whose handshake commitments mainstream businesses had refused honoring. What distinguished Whitaker case from other contract disputes was combination of agreement involving substantial sum representing families' entire annual income rather than small transaction, sacred oath ceremony, creating cultural commitment exceeding ordinary business deal. 12 witnesses, including distributors' own associates, observing terms. Webb's demonstrated pattern of exploiting multiple families through similar schemes. Discovery that profits from selling unpaid whiskey exceeded twice what agreement would have paid. Witnesses being coached to deny agreement's validity despite participating in oath ceremony. Systematic poisoning campaign employing distilling expertise in ways that demonstrated sophisticated chemistry knowledge. Successful elimination of entire target list before apprehension. Trial raising unprecedented questions about oral contract enforcement that legal frameworks had inadequately addressed. Most contract disputes had involved families accepting losses rather than pursuing legal remedies when costs exceeded potential recovery, had been resolved through reputation damage affecting exploitative businesses in communities where word of mouth mattered, hadn't resulted in violence except in isolated incidents rather than coordinated campaigns. Jennifer Webb's reconciliation work had been motivated partly by discovering through Morrison's research that her grandfather had exploited at least 23 families during career. That business community had tolerated practices because Webb provided access to quality moonshine, revelation that had created questions about whether grandfather had been criminal or had simply employed legal technicalities that commercial society considered acceptable business tactics, even when culturally devastating to mountain families. Jennifer's conversations with Whitaker family members had revealed that broken agreement, while triggering immediate poisoning campaign, had occurred within context of generations of commercial relationships where mountain producers had been systematically exploited by distributors who controlled market access. That refusing to honor witness commitment had been final violation in long series of grievances that had accumulated until collective response became inevitable, when authorities had demonstrated through refusing to enforce oral contracts that official channels wouldn't provide justice for populations whose cultural traditions legal system viewed as inferior. This broader context had become important in reconciliation dialogues because it explained why Whitaker violence had been so systematic and had involved multiple family members rather than being spontaneous individual response, helped participants understand that while poisoning campaign couldn't be legally justified, it had represented culmination of institutional failures affecting not just Whitakers but entire mountain communities, whose informal economies mainstream businesses had been exploiting through refusing to honor agreements that cultural practices made binding. Understanding that broken handshake agreement had been experienced not as isolated business loss, but as attack on families' economic survival and on cultural values that witnessed oaths represented, helped victims' families comprehend why reaction had been so extreme. While understanding that 19 deaths had affected families regardless of whether victims had directly profited from fraud or had merely provided legal testimony, helped Whitaker descendants recognize that violence had created suffering exceeding what any commercial exploitation could justify. Contemporary debates about Whitaker case reflected broader conflicts about limits of cultural business practice protections, about whether oral agreements should receive legal enforcement equivalent to written contracts, about how commercial law should address informal economies where documentation isn't practical or customary, about whether families should be held collectively responsible for members' coordinated violence, when economic desperation creates coercion. Annual memorial services organized by reconciliation participants attracted both supporters who viewed dialogue as path toward healing, and critics who maintained that focus should remain on condemning systematic murders rather than on examining contexts that might appear to justify poisoning campaign that had killed 19 people for one broken agreement, regardless of how devastating economic impact had been. The enduring questions that Whitaker case raises about appropriate legal protections for oral contracts in informal economies, about whether commercial exploitation through technical manipulation of documentation requirements can ever justify coordinated violence, about how business law should recognize cultural practices where witnessed agreements represent sacred commitments, about whether breaking handshake oaths witnessed by community members warrants severe consequences when legal remedies are unavailable. These remain unresolved 47 years after poisoning campaign, continue shaping debates about informal economy protections, about cultural business practice recognition, about limits of justifiable retaliation when economic survival is destroyed through fraud. Annual memorial gatherings demonstrate that time alone doesn't resolve fundamental disagreements about moral responsibility when commercial systems enable exploitation and when families respond through systematic violence. That honest examination requires acknowledging both legitimate grievances about broken agreements and 19 deaths affecting individuals' families, regardless of victims' degrees of participation in fraud or in legal testimony. Modern business ethics movements invoke Whitaker case when advocating for stronger protections for oral contracts, argue that current laws inadequately recognize that witnessed verbal agreements in cultural contexts, where handshake commitments are traditional business practice, deserve enforcement equivalent to written contracts. That Henry Whitaker Oral Contract Enforcement Protection Act, while important, represents minimum standards that should be expanded to include presumptions favoring enforceability when witnesses credibly confirm terms and to require commercial entities demonstrate why oral agreements shouldn't be honored, rather than requiring vulnerable parties prove documentation wasn't practical. Critics counter that emphasizing oral contract protections risks obscuring that 19 human deaths resulted from broken agreement, that focus should remain on preventing violence rather than on expanding contract enforcement that might enable fraud when verbal claims can't be verified through documentation. Descendants of Whitaker family, including Henry's great-great-granddaughter Rebecca Whitaker, age 32 in 2024, expressed nuanced perspectives about ancestors' systematic violence. Rebecca acknowledged that killing 19 people had created victims whose families had suffered regardless of whether deceased individuals had broken agreement or profited from fraud, but emphasized that understanding actions required recognizing cultural context, where witnessed handshake oaths represented sacred commitments whose violation attacked fundamental values that mountain communities considered essential for maintaining commercial relationships based on trust and reputation. Rebecca's balanced position created some controversy within broader mountain culture preservation community, where some argued that any acknowledgement of poisoning campaign's excessiveness risked betraying ancestors' defense of sacred traditions, while others maintained that honest examination required recognizing that violence had exceeded what any commercial exploitation could justify when witnesses who'd merely testified about legal requirements and establishment owners who'd purchased available product had been killed. Federal legislation establishing oral contract protections prompted examination of broader patterns, where legal systems had historically refused enforcing verbal agreements that cultural practices made binding. Department of Commerce analysis, examining approximately 1,200 disputes from 1950-2000 period, where oral contracts in informal economies had been contested, identified systematic patterns where mainstream businesses had exploited documentation requirements to avoid honoring commitments that witnesses confirmed, that courts had prioritized formal contracts over verbal agreements, despite evidence that parties from cultures emphasizing oral traditions had intended creating binding obligations. Analysis resulted in recommendations for presumptions favoring enforceability when credible witnesses confirm terms, for burden shifting requiring parties denying oral agreements to demonstrate why commitments shouldn't be honored, for mediation services specializing in informal economy disputes where cultural practices differ from mainstream business norms. Contemporary commercial law training incorporating Whitaker case emphasizes that recognizing oral contracts serves practical function, preventing exploitation. That understanding cultural business practices, where handshake agreements witnessed by community represent binding commitments, is necessary for conducting commercial relationships without creating grievances through technical manipulation of documentation requirements. That refusing to honor witnessed verbal agreements communicates contempt for populations whose traditions differ from mainstream practices, undermining commercial relationships. Training materials cite specific example of Webb's fraud, resulting in 19 deaths as demonstration that commercial exploitation creates cascading harms affecting business communities and families throughout regions. Consequences that legal recognition of oral contracts would have prevented if courts had acknowledged that witnessed handshake oaths represented sacred commitments deserving protection equivalent to written contracts. International commercial law organizations examining informal economy protections frequently cite Whitaker case as example, demonstrating consequences when legal frameworks fail. Recognizing cultural business practices, scholars note that oral contracts remain prevalent globally wherever literacy rates are low, legal services are expensive or inaccessible, or cultural traditions emphasize personal relationships over formal documentation. That Whitaker case, while extreme in its violent response, exemplified broader phenomenon where populations experience systematic exploitation when mainstream legal systems refuse enforcing verbal agreements that witnesses confirm and that cultural traditions consider binding. Research examining contract disputes across multiple nations has revealed patterns where oral agreement breaches have motivated violence. That Whitaker poisoning campaign represented broader dynamic where legal system failures enabling commercial exploitation created conditions where desperate responses became likely when families faced economic ruin from frauds that courts refused addressing. By 2024, the preserved handshake oath ceremony documentation had become powerful educational tool displayed at Tennessee Museum of Commercial History. Photographs and witness testimony records from 1977 showing 12 people observing Henry Whitaker and Marcus Webb clasping hands while swearing to honor 1,200-gallon agreement at $8 per gallon, visual documentation that allowed museum visitors to understand that agreement had been formalized through cultural ceremony rather than being casual conversation that Webb's later testimony had characterized it as. Educational placards explained handshake oath significance in mountain business culture, described how witnessed verbal commitments were considered more binding than written contracts that parties might sign without witnesses present, explained how Webb's breach had destroyed not just economic agreement, but sacred bond that cultural values held as fundamental to commercial relationships. Museum exhibit included recordings from Samuel Whitaker's presentations, where he'd explained that handshake agreement with 12 witnesses observing sacred oath wasn't informal understanding that either party could walk away from, was binding commitment that mountain culture held as more serious than any written contract, because our word and our honor were all we had when mainstream businesses wouldn't deal with moonshine producers through formal channels. Watching Webb sell our whiskey profitably while refusing payment, claiming verbal deal wasn't enforceable, felt like being robbed in daylight with law enforcement watching and doing nothing because thieves had exploited legal technicality, losing $4,800 that represented entire year's income, and all our investments meant family faced bankruptcy and potential loss of land that generations had held. Having courts refuse enforcing witnessed agreement because it wasn't written made us understand that legal system viewed mountain traditions as worthless and our oaths as meaningless. Museum's complimentary exhibit honored 19 killed individuals, displayed photographs and biographical information about each victim, included statements from families describing losses and describing perspectives about whether relatives' deaths had been preventable if oral contract enforcement had been prioritized, or whether deaths represented inevitable consequences when commercial fraud destroyed families' economic viability without legal recourse. Balanced presentation that refused simplifying story into narrative celebrating Whitaker resistance or condemning poisoning violence, acknowledged complexity requiring visitors to grapple with competing values about cultural business practice protection, about preventing commercial exploitation, about limits of justifiable retaliation when agreements are broken. Rebecca Whitaker's advocacy work, following her participation in reconciliation dialogues, had focused on promoting understanding between informal economy communities and commercial law enforcement agencies. She developed training programs used by Department of Commerce and Commercial Mediation Services, explaining mountain handshake traditions and explaining how cultural business practices could be recognized and protected without eliminating documentation requirements for situations where formal contracts were appropriate. Rebecca had emphasized in trainings that mountain families who conduct business through handshake agreements aren't trying to avoid accountability or documentation. We're maintaining cultural traditions that generations relied on when formal contracts weren't practical, and when our word and reputation mattered more than papers that lawyers wrote. When mainstream businesses exploit documentation requirements to avoid honoring witnessed commitments, exploitation destroys economic relationships and creates resentments that can explode into violence when families understand that legal systems protect fraudsters, rather than enforcing agreements that communities witnessed and confirmed. Modern legal scholarship examining oral contract enforcement has used Whitaker case as primary example when analyzing tensions between formal documentation requirements and cultural business practices. Scholars debate whether statute of frauds protections against unverifiable verbal claims should apply when credible witnesses confirm agreement terms, whether courts should recognize cultural contexts where oral commitments represent binding obligations, deserving enforcement equivalent to written contracts. Some argue that witnessed verbal agreements deserve legal protection regardless of documentation when evidence establishes parties intended creating binding obligations. That refusing enforcement enables systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations whose cultural practices differ from mainstream norms. Others counter that allowing oral contracts without written confirmation creates risks of fraudulent claims, and that legal systems require documentation for protecting all parties from disputes about terms. The broader implications of Whitaker case extended beyond individual tragedy when researchers examining informal economy exploitation discovered that Webb's fraud had represented systematic problem during 1970s-1980s when mainstream businesses were recognizing profit opportunities in mountain moonshine, while refusing to honor traditional business practices that producers relied on. That numerous distributors had employed similar tactics, exploiting legal technicalities to avoid payment while profiting from sales. Comprehensive studies examining this period revealed that hundreds, if not thousands, of mountain families had experienced contract breaches affecting regional economy and creating accumulated grievances that occasionally exploded into violence when specific incidents represented final violations that communities couldn't accept. Whitaker poisoning, while exceptional in its systematic coordination and lethality, exemplified dynamics where commercial exploitation combined with legal system failures had been creating dangerous situations throughout Appalachian regions where informal economies' mainstream frameworks inadequately protected. Until next time, remember that Whitaker clan poisoned 19 men after Nashville distributor Marcus Webb broke handshake agreement witnessed by 12 people, including Webb's own associates, agreement where sacred oath had been sworn promising to purchase 200 gallons whiskey at 8 gallon, but that Webb abandoned after taking 600 gallons without payment, while selling product for substantial profits totaling $18,000. That Webb exploited legal technicality, claiming verbal contracts exceeding $500 weren't enforceable despite witnesses confirming terms, and despite mountain culture holding handshake oaths as more binding than written contracts. That 5 family members coordinated systematic methanol poisoning campaign, targeting everyone involved in breaking agreement or in testifying it wasn't binding. That 15-day jury deliberation examined cultural business practices before convicting all defendants. That case prompted federal reforms establishing Henry Whitaker Oral Contract Enforcement Protection Act, requiring courts recognize witnessed verbal agreements as enforceable when cultural traditions support oral commitments. and that ultimately commercial exploitation, through technical manipulation of documentation requirements, creates economic devastation when legal systems refuse protecting cultural business practices, that breaking witnessed handshake oaths attacks fundamental values that mountain communities consider sacred, that systematic poisoning using contaminated whiskey represented family defending economic survival when distributors' fraud destroyed years' income, and when courts refused enforcing agreement that witnesses confirmed but that formal documentation requirements excluded from legal protection, that institutional failures dismissing mountain business customs as inferior to written contracts enabled commercial exploitation affecting entire regions whose informal economies depended on trust relationships that mainstream legal frameworks inadequately recognized deserving protection equivalent to formal contracts that commercial society employed, but that cultural traditions considered less binding than witnessed oaths, whose violation warranted severest consequences, when alternatives meant accepting that sacred commitments could be broken casually by outsiders exploiting legal technicalities while profiting from quality whiskey that family investments and craft expertise had created, based on promises that Mountain Code held as inviolable regardless of whether papers were signed. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of cultural business practices and commercial exploitation across 47 years, the discovery that distributor Webb systematically exploited at least 23 mountain families through similar schemes totaling $60,000 in unpaid agreements. The handshake oath ceremony witnessed by 12 people, including Webb's own associates, swearing to honor terms that legal technicality later excluded from enforcement, the sale of Whitaker whiskey for $18,000, while refusing payment, claiming verbal deal wasn't binding despite sacred commitment, the $4,800 economic devastation threatening families' survival and potential land loss. The systematic methanol poisoning campaign, targeting not only fraudulent distributor, but also witnesses who'd testified agreement wasn't enforceable, and establishment owners who'd purchased unpaid product, the 15-day jury deliberation examining whether mountain handshake traditions deserved legal recognition before convicting all 5 defendants. The federal legislation establishing oral contract protections named for Henry Whitaker, requiring courts honor witnessed verbal agreements when cultural practices support commitments. The Reconciliation Foundation uniting descendants 47 years later, while debate continues about whether killing witnesses who testified about legal requirements represented excessive response. The impossible questions about whether commercial fraud destroying families' economic viability justified coordinated violence and whether legal systems should enforce oral contracts equivalent to written documentation when credible witnesses confirm terms. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories examining how cultural business practices clash with formal legal requirements, how commercial exploitation through technical manipulation creates desperate responses, how witnessed handshake oaths in mountain culture represent sacred commitments whose violation attacks fundamental values. Comment about whether systematic poisoning was proportional response to broken agreement, or whether legal remedies should have been pursued despite courts refusing to enforce verbal contracts, whether 47 years provides adequate perspective for reconciliation when 3 defendants died in prison after decades of incarceration, whether memorial should emphasize Webb's fraud or acknowledge 19 deaths affecting victims' families, regardless of individuals' degrees of participation. Because these questions persist wherever informal economies operate, wherever cultural business practices emphasize oral commitments over written documentation, wherever legal systems prioritize formal requirements over witnessed agreements that communities consider binding, wherever commercial exploitation destroys economic survival through technical manipulation that courts enable rather than prevent, requiring continued examination of how mainstream legal frameworks should protect vulnerable populations, whose traditions differ from commercial norms and whose handshake oaths represent sacred bonds that generations have relied on when formal contracts weren't practical, but that modern business law inadequately recognizes deserving enforcement equivalent to written agreements that lawyers draft.